Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Raising the Bar, and today's a fascinating episode, I have to say. This gentleman's name is Paul Levy. He's a renowned author, artist, and spiritual teacher known for his profound explorations at the intersection of psychology and spirituality. With a background in art and a deep understanding of the human psyche, Paul has become a leading voice in discussions about consciousness, awakening, and the collective mind. In his writings, Paul introduces the concept of Wetiko, a psycho-spiritual mind virus. His work invites readers to explore the depths of the human psyche and the transformative power of facing one's shadow. Paul, welcome to the show, mate.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here with you. Really, it's just thank you for the invite.
No, thank you. I mean, this is a fascinating subject, and as I was just saying to you before, we went on air here. I don't think I've ever created so many questions for a subject before, and it's almost as if it's difficult to pinpoint the origins of this sort of stuff because it's almost happening in a quantum sense where it's difficult to know what comes first, the chicken or the egg. Is this an outside influence or something we generate on our own and vice versa? So it was putting the questions together in an order, in a linear sense, just wasn't happening for me. But anyway, what I thought would be a good starting point, nevertheless, would be: is it okay if you could give your definition of Wetiko just to set the foundations for the show, and then
Yeah,
I'll come in with the questions, I think.
for sure. And I should first, create context. This is, I'm not speaking as a scholar or a philosopher. This is coming from my own, personal
Cool.
experience that I've been having over 40 years, 24/7. And the word Wetiko, it's a Native American term. And, it's thought of as being a mind virus. And when people hear that, it can sound all new agey or woo woo. And what it really means is that the source of the collective madness that's happening in our world is to be found within the psyche. And that's a no brainer. And so it can be thought of as a mind virus that works through the blind spots of, we all have blind spots. And Watiko itself is the form of blindness, but it's a peculiar form of blindness that actually thinks it's sighted. It's not aware that it's blind. And not only that, it thinks it's more sighted than people who actually see. And so, in essence, Watiko, it's described as a cannibalistic spirit, because it's the source of the greatest evil that we play out, in our own mind, in relationship with each other, and in just collectively on the world stage. But I point out it's a quantum phenomena in that there's this superposition of states. It's the greatest evil, and it's also an incredible gift. It's helping our species to evolve, to awaken,
Hmm.
and it's helping us to unlock our own creative energy. Because Watiko, you see, in the apocryphal text, every spiritual tradition talks about it. And the apocryphal text, they talk about Watiko, but of course, it got edited out of the actual, canon of the Bible, because I point out Watiko was on the editorial board because it can't stand to be seen. And that's what my whole work is about, is trying to help people to see it. Because then when you see it, you take away its power and you become empowered. But the apocryphal text calls it the counterfeiting spirit. So it's an impersonator. It has no creative energy, but it plugs into our unconscious creative energy that we're not mobilizing and we're not accessing. And it plugs into our creative energy and it turns it against us. So being a counterfeiting spirit, it puts us on, it fools us, it offers us this false version of ourselves, this limited version. Oh, I'm traumatized, I'm wounded. Then, if we identify with its version, if we're not in touch with who we actually are in that moment, then we've given ourselves away. Then Watiko can manipulate us, can control us, and then we're doomed. And that's actually what's playing out collectively on the world stage. So what I'm pointing out is that this mind virus is at the bottom of the insanity and the evil that's playing out, but it's actually this revelation. It's a living revelation. It's revealing to us everything we need to know in order to connect with who we actually are and our true creative agency. But if we don't have the recognition of what it's revealing to us, it'll just like a program, it'll just assume its program function to continue to destroy us. And we become the instruments through which it acts itself out in our world. So it's the topic of topics. That's what
Mm.
Castaneda, as Don Juan, his teacher, say in the book. And there's nothing more important than this. And it's playing out. People, I make a joke just to conclude that if I had a marketing department, they couldn't do a better job of marketing and publicizing my work than the incredible insanity and evil that's playing out in our world.
Mhm.
And yeah, so that's just a little start. I could
Yeah,
write
that's great. No,
I've
that's
written
that's
two
brilliant.
books
Yeah,
about it. I have a
thank you
lot
for
to
that.
say. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah,
thanks for
yeah.
setting the stage nicely there. And I really want to talk to you about the insanity that's going on in the external world and what that actually reflects from the individual or from the individual psyche. But just before we get to that, I was going to
Right.
say, is this an individual phenomena? Because I'm trying to think of a metaphor here. Is this a little bit like if you're in a movie theater and you have the movie projection, so you have the actual projector shining the light on the wall, and then we're all looking at the wall and we're looking at it's a little bit like Plato's cave. We're looking at the movie
Right.
screen itself, thinking that is the reality, but actually it's the movie projector that's actually creating that. And if there's a damage to the lens on that movie projector, we're going to see a tainted, fragmented image on the screen. And what we're doing is we're scraping and howling at the actual wall at the movie screen, not realizing the origins that it comes from. Is that kind of where we go? Is that am I on the right
Yeah,
track with that?
that's a really good way in, because one of the things that I continually point out is that Watiko, it works through the projective tendencies of the mind. We're always projecting onto the waking ink blot. And so, the way projection works, if I hold up an ink blot and if you see, oh, there's a butterfly, the very moment you project onto that ink blot of a butterfly is the very moment that it'll appear as a butterfly. It's not a second later, it's instantaneous. And that's where we all have this genius, this creative genius in creating our experience. Okay, but yet because it happens outside of time, we become entranced by our own creative genius, by our own projections in such a way that we entrance ourselves, we hypnotize ourselves. And one very simple way of understanding this, because this is so profound, in a dream, if you're holding a viewpoint, what is a dream? But it's a projection, a reflection of the very mind that's dreaming it, right? So if you hold a viewpoint, the dream has no choice, being a reflection of your mind, to just reflect back all of the evidence confirming the seeming truth of your viewpoint. So now I have evidence confirming, oh, my viewpoint is true. Say, for example, my viewpoint is, oh, this world I'm inhabiting is objective. It exists separate from me. If I'm holding that viewpoint, the world, which is the dream, has no choice but to give me all the evidence confirming my viewpoint. Then I become even more entrenched in my viewpoint. So I even see even more that the world is objectively separate from me. And the more I see that way, the more the world will just reflect back, giving me all the evidence ad infinitum. It's a self-reinforcing feedback loop in which we actually hypnotize ourselves. And that's Watiko. And what my work is, and I'm trying to do this for myself too, is trying to, help people to see through that illusion in a way that unlocks our creative genius. So instead of our creativity getting turned against us, we actually can implement it and access our creative genius in a way that is in service to us.
I'm going to ask you about that in a minute, about that, unlocking the true self, or I don't know if there's a term that you use for that, but I would really like to go into that at some point about what that looks like once you've spiritually cleansed yourself. But I was going to say, let's use the analogy used there, the metaphor of the dream state. So let's just say a lucid dream where you awaken in the dream and you know that you're the creator and the participant in that dream. You're the game player and the creator in that moment. You're both simultaneously. But
Right.
in the dream metaphor, it's solipsistic. You know that you're the sole creator of everything that you see around you. But in the waking state, are we saying there then that it's still only me that exists in this reality, and I'm projecting this whole reality in front of me? But I've heard you talk about how it's a shared dream. It's like a
Yeah,
collective
yeah,
lucid dream. But then how
yeah,
would
yeah,
that
yeah,
work? Like how would you have multiple projectors projecting one reality if
yeah,
they've all got their own
yeah, yeah, yeah.
individual traumas and individual issues to deal with?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that's a great question. Totally. And I point out, and I began having this realization over 40 years ago that, oh my God, this is a collectively shared dream that we're all
Hmm.
dreaming up into materialization moment by moment. But then, when people say to me, oh, I have a lucid dream and then I can control the dream, I know they they don't know what they're talking about, because who's the I? When you have a lucid dream, you see that the figure who you identify as being, which is called, the dream ego, that's just a model for who you are. That's just who you've been unconsciously identifying. That who you are is the dreamer of the dream, and the dreamer of the dream is not separate from all of the manifestations of that dreamer. So the point is that to be careful when we say, like, oh, I'm then, controlling the dream, whether it's the night dream or the waking dream, who's that I? Because when you have lucidity in a dream, it would make no sense at all to control the dream. It's your own energy, but what you are in control of is yourself. Now, getting to the point you were making, but wait a second, there are 8 billion of us humans on this
Mm,
planet. And yeah, we're all having our own particular dream, in the same way that if there's this rainbow in the sky, if you and I see a rainbow,
mm,
we're not seeing the same rainbow. There's no objective rainbow that exists separate from our own mind. The rainbow, our experience of the rainbow, is nothing other than an image inside of our mind. So I'm seeing my own private rainbow, you're seeing your own private rainbow, and yet we're able to communicate so that we can actually share, have this shared experience where there are certain agreements
mm,
that we make amongst each other, so as to inhabit this collectively shared dream. And so that's really, because this is quantum physics. Quantum physics, is basically, that's
mm,
why I have a book I wrote on quantum physics, because it's actually offering us the medicine for Watiko. Because here, Watiko, in essence, is this misidentification of ourselves as existing as a separate self. So as soon as I think I exist as a separate self, then you're an other. As soon as you're an other, there's fear. Fear is the superfood for Watiko. But if I actually, and then if I identify with a separate self, I'm going to invest my whole energy and life force in defending and protecting this separate self that I'm imagining I am, when in essence, it's an illusion. It doesn't even exist. That's the root of the collective madness. And that's what Tico in a real nutshell. So the thing about the solution, just I'm really going right to the end point here, what is the medicine for Watiko is seeing through that imagination of the separate self. That's to recognize we're interconnected, that we're not separate, and that unlocks our creative spirit, because we begin to realize, wait a second, we're actually, via the way we're interpreting the ink blot of our experience, the ink blot of the waking dream, this meaning we're placing on it, we're actually creating our experience. So all of a sudden we begin to discover, wait a second, our nature is to be creative, and the energetic expression of this realization is compassion, is an open heart, is love.
mm.
And when we're actually in touch with the dreamlike nature, the non-local field in which we're all connected and contained, the creative nature of our true nature, and that love and compassion, then all of a sudden this Watiko virus, which actually doesn't even exist independently of our own mind, then it has no power over us at all, and we
Yeah.
become empowered.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I was just thinking there, could it be the case that you could you could acknowledge the fact that we're all interconnected in that quantum sense? There's no separation. It's like a pool of potential and possibility. We're just that in that kind of quantum soup all together, right? But could it also be the case simultaneously that we acknowledge the separation as well and the individuals with, for instance, we
Yeah,
could say that we are the ocean, but we're also the individual waves. You know,
yeah, yeah,
you're
yeah.
a wave
Well,
and I'm a
that's why
wave.
in Tibetan Buddhism they talk about there's the relative level and there's the absolute level.
Yeah.
And the two aren't separate, the two interpenetrate. So if somebody hears in the teachings of the Buddha, oh, we're all one, it's all a dream, and if they just identify with that and they marginalize the relative, and in the
Mm,
relative, wait a second, we're separate beings, you're over there, I'm over here, and we need to honor that, that's not to be awake. The idea is to hold in your mind these seemingly contradictory points of
mm,
view.
mm,
That's the logic in quantum physics and Buddhism and dreaming. It's the four valued logic, where instead of it's something true or false, it's both true and false.
yeah.
So we're both interconnected in one and on another level we're separate, and both are true simultaneously. That's the enlightened logic of the dreaming,
Mm.
and that underlies Buddhism, and that's the logic that underlies quantum physics.
Yeah, we're the I and the we together all simultaneously. Because I was going to
Yeah,
say,
yeah,
if we were just the we and not the I, then there'd be no reason to do any work on ourselves individually because everything's just playing out in a kind of cosmic soup anyway, as it's meant to. But
yeah.
that's why so because
Right.
yeah,
And that's why the
yeah,
key thing is, it's so overwhelming what's happening in the world, and people can fall into despair and pessimism and
yeah.
helplessness. But the idea is that the intervention point is the individual. When any one of us does our inner work, and however you say it, seeing their shadow,
Mm.
awakening to the dream, seeing Watiko, seeing the quantum non-local field, that's the very act that we ourselves are being asked to do. And the idea being, and it's a beautiful image, that when you have a glass of water and you dissolve, crystal, like say you
Mm.
have sugar, and
Yeah.
you dissolve each granule of sugar into the water, it dissolves and dissolves, and then it reaches the saturation point, and you add one more grain of sugar, and a crystal will manifest. And
Mm.
that's a beautiful image for how symbols arise in the unconscious. And it's a beautiful image how any one of us in this moment having realization of our nature might be that grain of sugar that precipitates a global awakening in the collective
Oh
consciousness. And
wow.
that's true. That's a beautiful symbol that actually inspires real hope.
Yeah, well, that's the story of Buddha, isn't it? That he himself was the manifestation of the whole, but he enlightened through his own individual experience. But then that individual experience affected the whole. That was my take from it. But
Totally,
yeah,
totally. And that's the idea, because we're interconnected,
yeah,
you know,
fractal.
any
Yeah,
of us having realization, right, non-locally, instantaneously, it gets deposited in the greater mind field,
mm,
and that is so inspiring, because you see, one of the great dangers is to fall into that pessimism, and just, oh, let me just make the best of it, or go numb, or
mm.
whatever, and then you're unwittingly offering yourselves into the hands of Watiko.
Yeah. I like that. It's like if you unlock the keys to yourself, you unlock the keys to the universe. I've also heard that being said before, but it's the idea that it's fractal. It's
Yep.
like holographic. You can take out one part of the hologram. If you affect that, it affects the whole hologram, and vice versa,
Yeah.
because it's fractal. It's interconnected, and that's kind of what we're saying here, isn't it?
Exactly, exactly. One of the beautiful images in the East is Indra's net, which are
Mm,
these interconnected, like precious, like these gems that are interconnected with these like strings, and think of each of those gems as like a sentient awareness, like
mm.
one of us with our awareness, and but they're all reflecting each other and being reflected by each other, at the same time. And so any of us having realization and adding more light to our awareness instantaneously gets picked up and reflected via all the jewels, which then gets reflected back to us.
Is this connected to kind of like morphic resonance? So I don't know if you've heard of the hundredth monkey effect.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's
I,
exactly like that.
is it
And that's
that?
why
Yeah,
In
yeah,
the Bible, they'll actually talk about the symbolic number 144,000. And it's exactly that, the 100th monkey phenomena.
yeah,
Just like if I'm making bread, if I have, yeast, I have to have enough yeast in the bread for it to rise. When there are a sufficient number of us in the world right now who are actually awakening and particularly connecting with each other, it's like that yeast in the bread, that hope that will help all of humanity to
yeah.
rise to.
It's inspiring other how should we say yeast to grow simultaneously just through the law of resonance. Just because there's almost like a shared field that people can tune into, and it's almost like instantaneous, and then people are kind of
Yeah,
raising their
yeah, yeah.
vibration at the same time. It just connects like vibrationally. It's kind of
Yeah,
hard
and
to
it's very much like the
conceptualize.
shaman, like a
Yeah,
shaman. And in my work, I point out we're all cast in the role of potential shamans,
yeah,
because that's the major archetype that's activated in the collective unconscious. And in a shaman, it typically there's a crisis. They can even go crazy, but they have to make a descent into the underworld of the unconscious, into the darkness. But the idea of the shaman is they literally take on the illness of the person or the community they're working with, and they become ill, they become sick. And
Mm,
taking on to take within themselves and to have it out with, it has
yeah.
two meanings. But then what makes an accomplished shaman a shaman is that they take on that illness, and instead of just staying ill, and that would be tragic,
Mm,
then the occasion of them falling ill and experiencing the illness as an inside job within themselves, that helps them to reconnect with the wholeness of the self in an even deeper way. And them doing that, it's as if they've cleared a pathway in the collective unconscious, making it that much more probable that other people will be able to find their way back to the wholeness of their
mm.
nature, and that can go viral.
Yeah, out of interest, I mean, tell me if this is far out, but I believe that place where you return back to wholeness is in the heart space. I think that we're told it's a pump. I actually think it's a vacuum, and I think what happens is it's almost like a portal, and that's where the origins of life. I don't know if that they talk about this in the quantum world, but I think that actually that dropping into the heart space, there's something where it kind of you go into that infinite emptiness where it's all potential and all possibility, and that's it's from that heart space that's where you can connect back to your wholeness, or as you
That's
would say,
so
the inverse of
beautiful.
that is the emptiness and wholeness together. That's the paradox in that place.
That's
In
right on. That's really,
yeah.
really cool. Because in Tibetan Buddhism, I that's the practice I do for years.
Mm,
They talk about that the mind is located in the heart,
mm,
and that the highest value is the open heart, the good heart.
yeah.
That's our nature. When people talk about, oh, connecting with your nature, what is our nature? Our nature is love, is compassion, and our nature is to be creative, you
Mm,
know. And so when we have realization of our nature, we become a loving person. We cultivate compassion and we embody and express ourselves creatively. And the more we do that, the more that we even more experience and have a deeper experience of our true nature in a positive feedback loop
yes.
that is actually creating light upon light.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, we're hitting some real profound wisdom here. It's unbelievable. It's brilliant what we're coming up with here in just a short amount of time. I mean, before we come on to like encouraging people to reach that state, I still want to stick on the mind virus bit at the moment because I want to talk about how this is manifesting at the moment. I mean, I don't know if you see it the same way, but I'm seeing like the efforts to centralize power, concentrate power, like a totalitarian agenda to, you know, have us all as plebs, as serfs, and then like the 1% have all like the power. And we can see that in the last 4 years, and they're kind of using excuses to do it. And the majority of people are going along with it. But I can see this the totalitarian tiptoe, that need to kind of consume and hoard and dominate. What's the internal expression of that from the individual
Yeah,
psyche's point
yeah,
of view?
that's beautiful because the thing about Watiko, which is so unbelievable, it's an inner disease of the soul that
Yeah,
somehow has a magical ability to extend itself out in the world and configure events so as to express itself,
yeah,
so as to reflect the inner process. And yeah, so what's going on in the world? I'm right with you. There's a centralization of power and
mm,
control. They're trying to take away our freedoms.
yeah,
Fascism, totalitarianism is spreading all over the world. That's an outer experience that is reflected via what happens when Watiko colonizes our mind. So what happens, Watiko, it will actually, subsume the healthy parts of the psyche into its service. It will set up a shadow government inside the psyche. It'll dictate to the ego. So all of a sudden, and of course, the inner sort of agency of the psyche, that's like these regulatory agencies, just like the regulatory agencies in the world that are supposed to sort of be monitoring,
mm,
all the negative energy so that they don't corrupt them. They've been co-opted and taken over. The regulatory agency of our psyche has been co-opted by the Watiko virus. And so then we unwittingly become instruments for the Watiko virus. And what I'm describing, Jung, the great psychiatrist, he was totally tracking Watiko. He didn't have the name. He called it totalitarian psychosis. And that inner process that I've described of colonizing the psyche, setting up a shadow government, taking over the executive function of the psyche, that is an inner process that's actually getting reflected
mm,
via what's happening in the world. And when you see that, that's when you're beginning to see the dreamlike nature.
mm,
Because what is the dreamlike? When you're in a dream, Well, what is the nature of the dream you're having? It's an outer manifestation of what's happening inside of your psyche. So
Yeah.
the inner and the outer are recognized to be reflecting each other. What I'm saying is that when you see that in your waking state and you have the recognition that the evil that's playing out in the world is reflecting the very process that's potentially playing out inside of our psyches, to the extent we're afflicted with Watiko, that's to recognize the dreamlike nature, and that's to begin to wake up.
So how would it then be the case that let's say someone does drop into the heart space, they're coming from love and compassion and like, they've done the shadow work, they've moved, they've transcended that, or transcended included that, they've integrated their shadow. How is it that they're still in this reality where where they're a part of this totalitarian one world government effort then? Surely they would have
Yeah,
moved past that in the external world, would they not?
yeah, yeah. Well, no, I mean, in Buddhism, it's the idea of here's the figure, somebody meditating and they become enlightened and
Mm.
they're about to enter into nirvana, the Buddhist equivalent of heaven. And then the story goes, they look back and they see all of their fellow brothers and sisters,
Mm.
suffering, which are they recognize if they're truly awake, those are parts of myself. So instead of entering into nirvana where all is good and
Mm.
all that, they make the bodhisattva vow. They say, no, I'm not going to enter nirvana until I'll first bring everyone else there first. And only then will I enter it. And that's where, the highest ideal in Buddhism is to become the bodhisattva. And the translation of the word bodhisattva is a being in the process of awakening. And who among us is not that? We're all awakening. And, at a certain point, because my whole process started based on this incredible trauma
Mm.
that just created enormous suffering. And, I don't need to go into the story, but it almost killed me and it destroyed my entire family. I mean, I haven't had a family for over 20 years. I mean, I have a ton of friends and a soul family, so I'm all good. But I remember I was so committed to healing myself. And then at a certain point, I had the realization, oh, I'm never going to be fully healed until everybody is healed. That's the idea of the bodhisattva point of view.
Yeah, lovely. So could it be the case then that even though all this 8 billion people they're on different levels of awareness and they're at different levels of their own kind of how would you call this, like transformation, they're at different points in their own transformation. Some are further down the line than others, some are more enlightened than others, some are very dark, and like projecting more from that shadow, but they're all still seeing the same reality though. Is that still, that would make sense, would it then? Or would they still
Well,
would
I
they be
mean,
seeing
I don't
something
know if that
different?
if that would be an accurate way of saying it when you say they're all still seeing the same reality.
Right.
They're all like sharing a collective dream, and somebody might be seeing it as, oh, this is like horrible, and like,
Mm.
evil is taking over the world, and somebody else might see that, and at the same time, they might see, oh my God, this is all a revelation, and this is all helping us to evolve and wake up. Where the first person doesn't see that part, so we're not all seeing the same thing.
You're right, because I just thought of an analogy like we could both have orange juice, but one of us could put salt on our tongue, and it completely changes the objective taste of the orange juice just on the subjective, the way that we change things subjectively. So if someone's got a little bit of trauma or they're still working through something subjectively, even though the objective world is the same, they might perceive that in a more of a nasty kind of evil, like threatening way, just because of what's going on in their
Yeah.
own internal subjective psyche, right?
Yeah, yeah, and
Yeah,
one
okay.
way, and it's a great way of understanding this being a dream, is like, for example, like I mentioned a little while ago, if we see this rainbow,
Hmm.
we're not seeing the same rainbow, and our experience of the rainbow, I mean, there's no objective rainbow. Like if we're not looking at the rainbow, there's no rainbow. The rainbow is just an image in our mind. Well, what quantum physics is saying and what Buddha is saying is
Hmm.
that that's not just for a rainbow. That's for the whole phenomenal universe. That, say, for example, if I'm seeing this red color in an object, that object doesn't have, it's not red. There's no red in that object. No,
Hmm.
that red, that experience of red is my psyche interacting with this seeming objective world to create an experience in my mind of being red.
Hmm.
And so, this is what quantum physics, which I point out is offering the medicine for Watiko, it's actually discovered empirically again and again. It's proven there's no such thing as an objective world, in the
Mm,
sense that our act of observing the world actually influences the world we're observing. Now, just think about that. That's a description of a dream, that the act of perception,
mm,
the act of observation is a factor in the equation of the creation of the universe. And but we've become so unconscious of that that we then just assume that the world exists objectively, and that we're just passive observers. But then quantum physics comes along and it dispels that illusion. And it gets even crazier than that, because when you realize what quantum physics is pointing at, wait a second, if there's no objective world out there and there's no objective things that I'm seeing separate from the actual seeing of them, then that means the act of observation is creative. That
mm,
we, and right there, that's the rabbit hole into the incredible, unimaginable creative power that all of us have. But then when you realize that there's nothing objective, what happened to the subject? Me. Because as a subject, I need an object to be in relationship to in order to be a subject. But if now I'm seeing through the imagination of there being an object, who am I? All of a sudden,
mm.
when you have the realization there's no objective world, it begs the question,
Yeah.
what is your nature? And that's where I point out that unwittingly quantum physics has promoted itself to become a spiritual path.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's like if a tree falls down in a forest and no one's there to hear it, did it make a noise? But I also
Right,
think
exactly.
I think it, people are talking about what we live on. Is it a globe? Is it flat? Is it holographic? Is it, whatever?
Right.
I've often thought that there actually is no objective physical like world. It's just it has to be observed, and as it's observed it creates it into being. A little bit like I use an animation software here called Blender, and you make 3D objects on this, and it starts off on like a flat plane, and it's like a grid, and then you can keep moving forward with your mouse and going further and further forward, and you see this horizon, and you keep going towards the horizon, but it's just infinite. And so this will keep going on for infinite, this infinite plane of existence until you put the laptop down and then it's gone. And I think that's actually what reality is. I think that we are on a plane of existence. And only when we reach that point and observe it, we bring it into being in that collective sense. And then the moment that we take our eyes off it collectively, it's not there anymore. I actually think that it's
Yeah.
more along that line than
Yeah, well,
than
that's what
objective.
you're saying is so right on. And that's why that Einstein, who is one of the founders of quantum physics, he could never embrace it,
Mm,
because he would ask, he was very distressed by the implications, because he was saying, wait, do you mean if I'm not looking at the moon doesn't exist type of thing?
yeah.
It's that same Zen koan that snaps you out of that fixed point of view of imagining that there's an objective world out there, that you're a subject and the two are interacting. No, there's no interaction of two separate things. It's all part of one seamless continuum of one whole. And that's why, quantum physics has pointed out again and again that this universe is completely whole. There's no separate parts interacting.
Mm.
And of course, we can only see that as we more get in touch with our own wholeness.
Yeah, people can look at the slit experiment as well, by just the act of observation affected the wave particles, didn't it?
Right. Well, that double slit
Yeah,
experiment, that
double.
was the key,
Yeah,
that was the doorway, the
yeah.
whole foundation of quantum physics. I
Mm,
have a chapter in my book about that. The quantum physics book is enfolded and encoded within the double slit experiment. Like the idea, like they're looking at light, and sometimes it manifests as a wave and other times as a particle. Well, is it a particle? Is it a wave?
mm,
And it blew their mind when they realized, wait, it's a function of how we observe it.
But the quantum world is far more mysterious than they could have imagined. When they observed, the electron went back to behaving like a little marble. It produced a pattern of two bands, not an interference pattern of many. The very act of measuring or observing which slit it went through meant it only went through one, not both. The electron decided to act differently, as though it was aware it was being watched.
That's why Watiko is a function of how we dream it. You see, in quantum physics,
Mm.
it proved no, this isn't this deterministic cosmos, that it's probabilistic, and that how things turn out, are we going to just destroy ourselves? Well, that's a quantum possibility. Or are we going to actually, is there enough pressure in the alchemical vessel of the human psyche so that we actually evolve and wake up? Well, that's a possibility. Well, is it going to be one or the other? That depends on us. We are the dreamers.
Yeah, there's fields of potential, and it's about, moving it into that somehow, choosing
Yeah,
that
yeah,
path.
yeah.
Yeah,
With
yeah,
with consciousness,
yeah, with
instead of
consciousness.
unconsciously,
Yeah,
just enacting our unconscious wounds and trauma, where we can't help but to compulsively act out
yeah,
our, and recreate our trauma. That's the repetition compulsion of trauma. But encoded in that pathology, the repetition compulsion is the symptom of trauma.
mm,
Encoded in that, in which we're continually re-traumatizing ourselves,
yeah,
we're actually trying to experience something consciously. And when we do that, then all of a sudden that unlocks that compulsion. And then that same energy that we had
yeah,
just been consciously acting out our abuse on ourselves and others is available for
mm,
creativity, for love, for compassion.
yeah. Yeah, but we're in that kind of negative feedback loop, like you said before. I don't know if you've heard of Michael Tsarion, but he talks about the fracturing of the quantum field into duality. It's represented through the psychic split between the conscious and the unconscious aspects of the human mind. So I don't know if that's similar to what you're saying, but he sees this quantum split as the metaphysical origin of psychic viruses, spiritual pollution, and false realities that afflict human minds and culture. That's kind of what he's
Yeah,
saying.
I'm not aware of his
Yeah.
work. I want to ask you, maybe you could send me a
Yeah, I
link
will do.
after
Yeah,
the
yeah,
interview. I would love. I'm always open for expanding, because so many, I'm just a translator,
yeah,
but so many people are articulating what I'm pointing out, in their own way. And
yeah.
that's really interesting to me, because
Mm,
you know Philip K. Dick being an example, the sci-fi writer, and he was talking about the Black Iron Prison. And the more
mm,
I studied his work, the more it blew my mind, that, oh my God, he's describing precisely to a
mm,
T how Watiko works.
mm,
And so with this person, it seems that he's pointing out that our nature of ourselves and of the universe is non-dual. And because we've sort of artificially sort of created a duality of something that is non-dual in nature and can actually ultimately, it can never be bifurcated or
yeah.
separated, that's in a way exactly what I'm saying. That is the origin of the mind virus.
Yeah, and he says the mending of that shattered quantum realm and restoring it to like unified consciousness. He calls it the alchemical great work, as in alchemy, alchemical.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah,
Well,
yeah,
I
that's his
point
name.
out, right. I mean,
Mm,
it's funny, even in my quantum book, I have a whole chapter on the alchemists,
yeah,
because they were plugged into this and, trying to understand it in their own way. And
yeah,
so many of these, like the Gnostics, the alchemists, they all were pointing at this exact same process
mm,
that the Native Americans call Watiko. And that's what I mean. I'm just a translator.
mm,
Just as a modern person, I'm trying to, in a way, translate all of this indigenous wisdom that's, gone on throughout the centuries into a modern psychological idiom, because we all sense that something is really awry and that something is amiss. And it's like we were saying, a self-generating, self-reinforcing feedback loop.
yeah,
It's like a Frankenstein monster that we've created, and at a certain point it potentially becomes out of our control. Or
mm,
it's like the Sorcerer's Apprentice, who've conjured up this magical tiger that then devours us. So our own conjuration destroys us. And
mm,
that's an example of we're not conscious of our creative genius. You see, that's in essence the real ultimate medicine and solution for this mind virus,
mm,
is for each one of us to access consciously our creative nature and to express ourselves creatively. Because if we don't do that, that same energy that would inform our creative energy, it has no place to go, but it turns inwards then, and then informs destruction, self and other destruction, like we're seeing in the world
Mm.
today.
It's funny you should say that because for the last 10 years, I've been a coach and I developed a philosophy called social heartistry. I don't normally talk about this on my podcast, but I think it's quite relevant now. And so it's like social mentoring. But what I found was most people that came to me, they were stuck in their heads and they were thinking about what to say, over analyzing everything, over intellectualizing everything, mechanizing the social world, right? So I got them to drop down into the space of the heart, from heart-centered awareness, I called it. And from there, you can be the artist. So the artist doesn't try and take validation. They're expressing, they're giving unconditionally. The artist also doesn't care what anyone else thinks of them because it's about expressing for their own artistic joy. It's not about trying to copy other people. It's about being the artist, the individual, not a photocopy of someone else. That's what a true artist is. So when you combine
Yeah,
that, I call that social artistry. So I was getting guys to, drop down into the field of the heart and just come from that, be the artist, express unconditionally. It's a giving feeling. It's an unconditional c'est la vie, bringing out into the world as a paintbrush rather than trying to go into your head, especially the left brain, which might talk about on another episode, but locking into the left brain, which is all about detail. Everything's linear, sequential, block by
yeah,
block,
analyzing. Yeah,
analyzing, and so coming out of that into the heart space and being that artist was, very transformational for, these
yeah,
guys.
yeah, yeah. And what you're
So,
saying is so
yeah.
great because for me, I identify myself as a creative artist, and it's not about product, like how many books I write or paintings, a
Mhm.
person makes. It's about process. And I want to point out the creative artist is the shaman, and
Yeah.
the shaman is the wounded healer. Those are all, in my imagination, equivalent terms. And, you know, so instead of suffering from, in other words, the poison of the unexpressed, like I want to point out that the greatest poison in the human psyche is repressed or unexpressed creativity that literally becomes psychospiritual poison.
Oh, yeah.
So the idea, it's what Christ was saying in the apocryphal text: if you bring forth what's within you, it'll save you. If you don't bring forth what's within you, it'll destroy you. So that idea of the healer who's wounded, and I totally relate to that archetype because, like I said, my process, it started from this unbelievable trauma, and I still feel the wound of it. But
Mm.
instead of me holding that wound as like a problem or, oh, I need to resolve it, yeah, I would love to have it not there. But I've learned to carry it in a way where that wound becomes a portal, becomes a doorway into my creative gifts. And that is the archetype of the wounded healer, because I'm so familiar with the experience of being wounded. I feel it 24/7, but I don't identify with it in a problematic way. That when I meet other people who are in their trauma and wounded, I'm very comfortable in just presencing that wound and being with them without compulsively needing to fix them or give them
Mm.
advice.
Or fix yourself. You don't feel like you need to fix yourself either.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That I can be,
Mm.
awake and enlightened and perfect and whole, even though another part of me feels like totally fucked up and all that. And the idea that I'm just not identifying or being absorbed in the negative identity, and I'm just becoming more and more familiar with my nature. And my nature, the idea is, in all the wisdom traditions, they say your nature, you already are whole. You already are awake. And that's really interesting because the way I envision that is atemporally, outside of time, we've already awakened, right? And as an individual or as a
Mm.
species. And when we like actually tune into that energy
Yeah.
in a way, we like in a magnetic way attract that experience to be our experience.
What you resonate with that, the part of yourself that's already completely whole in a cosmic sense.
Right, right. You
Oh,
actually
yeah.
invoke it, and more you're able to embody it, incarnate it.
So that's how you manage the two simultaneously. You're carrying the wound, let's say, but then you're also connected to your infinite self. Let's just call it that.
Yeah. Like, for example,
Yeah.
say my wound manifests in this moment, right?
Yeah.
And it's very convincing. And there are two ways that I could relate to it. On one hand, I could be like, oh, my wound is coming up. This is evidence that I'm really a wounded person.
Yeah.
So now I like start to identify myself as, well, I'm wounded. Or then say I'll identify with the wound. I absorb into it and then I've made it real, or I contract against the wound. No, 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 I don't want to be wounded, but I'm unwittingly, unconsciously investing it with power, or I wouldn't have to contract against it. So all of those strategies then just are feeding the cycle that there's something wrong with me, that my situation is
Yeah.
problematic and wounded. But the other way of seeing it, in the very moment that you're experiencing your wound, if you're awake in that moment, you have the realization, oh, that's just the impermanent display of my mind. That's just like this impermanent reflection on the mirror. And the
Yeah.
mirror is my nature. And the mirror is always there. The mirror is always pure. The mirror is always accessible. And the fact that then you have the realization, oh, who I am is the mirror, that isn't tainted or stained by even the vilest reflection. So no matter how dark and deep the wound is manifesting in that moment, you're able to just embrace it and be with it and to allow it to self-liberate instead
Yeah.
of identifying with
Simultaneously. Yeah.
clinging or
Yeah.
grasping or absorbing or contracting against. All of those are strategies of Watiko. But if you just allow it, and the only way you're able to do that is that in that moment, you have the occasion of the wound coming up actually help you to remember, oh, yeah, who I am is the mirror. So it's not like, no, I'm like disowning the wound. No, that's a part of me, but it's not actually who I actually am. So then when the wound comes up, it's actually an ally. It actually is helping you.
Yeah. And I think there's different ways people deal with that. They can either get completely subsumed by the pain and it creates that negative feedback cycle where everything they see reinforces that pain in the outside world. You have some people that avoid the pain and that creates more suffering. And then you have the people that spiritually bypass where they're completely pretending that nothing's going on, in their bodies, no trauma, and they're just all happy, happy, pretending.
Right.
That's I call it spiritual bypassing or positive
Yeah, no,
bypassing. Yeah.
that's a great phrase. And I see that a lot. I mean, there are people with my work who
Mm,
just they'll see my books on Watiko and it'll, maybe the subtitle will have evil, breaking the spell of evil or something like that. And they'll immediately contract, going, no, 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 I don't want to put my intention on anything dark
mm,
because that feeds evil. And in one sense, there is some truth to that. But what they're doing by avoiding, they're actually by avoiding, the darkness in the world, they're avoiding relationship with something in themselves.
mm,
And by doing that, by turning a blind eye, another way of describing Watiko, well, I've said this before, I think it's a form of blindness. And so by them being like an ostrich and turning that blind eye and not wanting to look at evil, whether it's in the world or in themselves, they're unwittingly offering themselves into Watiko's hands. So I just want to point out, I mean, if you see this as a dream, here's whatever you call it. I like the word evil because I feel there's no better word to describe, what's happening in the world in certain ways. And we have to come to terms with it. And like, here's Jung, one of the greatest thinkers, I think, in so many centuries. And he's saying, yeah, we don't become enlightened by imagining figures of light. No, we become enlightened by making the darkness conscious. And I'll just add to that, it's not that light. So here's light, it illumines darkness. That's what light does. But light is also, it actually, light reveals itself through the darkness. Okay. And this is very Kabbalistic. The
mm,
Kabbalah talks about the ascent. What is it?
mm.
The ascent on behalf of the descent, something like that, where the idea, if we want to ascend and connect with our light, we have to descend into the darkness. And that's where the true light is found,
Yeah.
and that's what alchemy is all about, is finding, is freeing matter that's trapped, freeing the spirit that's trapped in matter, freeing the light that's trapped in the darkness. The idea is that encoded in the darkness is a higher form of light,
Mm,
and that's what my whole work is about, is trying to show people, hey, we need to see what is this energy in us. So many people I'll work with, and they're like, oh, I'm not creative. I feel resistance. I'm stuck. I'm blocked. And I'm always interested, what's going on there? That
mm.
there's some factor or energy or seeming entity within our own minds that seems to be adversarial.
Yeah.
Whenever we start to connect with our light, it tries to stop us. And I'm basically saying, no, we need to shed light on that. What is going on there? And this isn't just me, even in like Buddhism, some of the greatest bodhisattvas, like Shantideva, the one who wrote the classic Way of the Bodhisattva, he was in the book, he's talking about, wow, there's something that's like a sorcerer that's numbing my mind and making me fall asleep and
Mm.
stopping me from connecting with my light. What is that?
Yeah, what is that?
That's what I'm pointing out. That's what I'm pointing at. And of course, so
Yeah.
many people just spiritually bypass and like, no, 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 I don't want to go there. I just want to identify with my light. And they're like minions for Watiko.
And what is that? Is that, have you heard of the expression egregore? Egregore.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. There's a actual section on
right.
that
Yeah.
in one of my books. And the thing about like these egregore, however you say it,
Yeah.
it's like a self-created sort of demon
Yeah.
that in Tibet, for example, they have a different word for it, hopa, that would actually materialize.
Mm.
And they say, yeah, as hard as it is to actually conjure that up, it's way harder once it's conjured up and has a seeming reality to dissolve it, you know? And
Yeah.
so I think that's a really good symbol, like the egregore
Yeah.
of like what's happening. We've actually conjured up
Yeah.
this golem, this Frankenstein monster, this egregore, both within our minds and in the world. And it's more and more getting in the driver's seat of our vehicle. And that's why it's a very dangerous time, But I want to point out
Mm.
that the greater the intensity, the fiercer, the stronger those demons are,
Yeah.
that's actually an expression that we're getting closer to our light. Okay.
Yeah.
Because when there's dark shadow, it's expression that there's a really powerful light that's projecting the shadow that's nearby. So for years, I was feeling this negative, these demons, and
Mm.
I was like, wow, I must be really screwed up. What's going on? And then my teachers reflected back the fact that it's like, no, Paul, because you or anyone who has incredible potential for light and is getting closer to the light, yeah, the demons, that attracts the darker forces. And so it's actually a good sign. So every day, because I'm having a new book coming out this year
Mm.
and I'm already writing my next book, and every day when I write, as soon as I sit down, I feel this incredible resistance and these
Yeah.
incredible demons.
Yeah.
And I've learned, oh, what great news.
You're
I'm
getting
really on.
close. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And for
The
example,
mosquitoes always surround the light. It's that kind of thing, isn't
yeah,
it?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Because
exactly. And then
the
the guy
brightness
who's the
will
reader,
attract the moths kind of thing.
exactly.
Yeah.
The flame tracked him
So,
off. And the guy who's the reader of the Watiko books, the last two Watiko books,
mm.
he's a really good friend of mine. And he's this kind of priest, he's a minister. And he was saying, Paul, when I was reading, for the audiobooks, when I was reading your work on Watiko, I could not believe it. I was getting absolutely assaulted by demons.
Yeah.
And I began laughing. I say, well, imagine what it was like writing the
Writing
book.
it. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So can I ask then, because you mentioned entities and that kind of stuff, and I just interviewed a guy called Jerry Marzinski. He's a retired psychiatrist,
Oh,
and
I'm familiar with his work. Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
I
so
really like
he
his
basically
work.
was talking to all these schizophrenic patients, and they all had repeatable fixed patterns. They weren't hallucinations, and they were demonic, like conversations they were having. And he believes that it could be like a transdimensional entity attachment, but you would say that's still a part of your own psyche, though. That's where it.
Yeah. Well,
So
I would say remember that any dream is multidimensional and all dimensions can be true. And so
yeah,
there's the relative and the absolute. And on the relative level, yeah, transdimensional entities, you need to honor them and take care.
yeah,
You have to be able to deal with them. But then on the ultimate level, the idea that there are like these transdimensional entities that are other than yourself is a joke. That
yeah,
holds no currency at all, because if you wake up fully, you have the recognition that it's all your own energy. There's nothing that's other. And one very simple way of understanding it is just in psychology. They'll talk about, oh, we get traumatized. What happens when we get traumatized? We split, we disassociate, right?
mm,
We don't then integrate that disassociated complex. It develops a seeming life and a seeming autonomy of its own. And in psychology, it's called an autonomous complex. And the indigenous people, that's what they call a demon.
yeah,
Okay. And that demon will get dreamed up to be adversarial, will be antagonistic towards whatever we want to do. And that autonomous complex demon, that's a very simple way of describing Watiko.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah. And at some point we could even talk about, what people refer to as Satan or the devil, could just be that part of the psyche that's been manifest,
Oh,
in that kind of, if you will project a certain image or a certain thought form, all those thought forms, come together and that forms like a morphic field. And then people can then tune into that morphic field and then, summon that. And that's what they say, summoning the devil. They could be summoning that energy from that morphic field that everyone's putting their attention to. When everyone prays to Mecca, that is a morphic field that they're all, trying to get in resonance
yeah,
with. When people pray, you might be getting into resonance with maybe Jesus Christ or whichever kind of, deity that you worship in that moment. But it's
yeah,
in that kind of astral, it's in that kind of energetic holographic world that you can then tune into, right?
yeah, yeah. No, that's totally beautiful. And that's why, like, to create, particularly to connect with other people who
Mm,
are awakening to what we're like describing, this morphic field gets created, which is based on what we're having the recognition of, that we're not separate, that we're interconnected.
yeah.
And one way of understanding this is like in a dream. If, say I'm in a dream, ordinary dream, I don't know I'm dreaming, and then I have lucidity, and oh wow, I'm recognizing that this is, just my
Mm,
own mind. But then just to imagine if other of those dream characters in that dream, if they become lucid and you then connect with each other and you trip out on, what are we realizing? Oh my God, this dream universe is manifesting the way it is because we've been conditioned to dream it that way. If the dream
yeah.
universe is really limited and problematic and wars and people killing each other, oh yeah, we've been programmed. That's a outer reflection in the dream of our inner state of fragmentation.
Mm,
And as we get more coherent and get more in sync with each other and deepen our recognition that we're actually interconnected, it's what I call our sacred power of dreaming. We
mm,
can dream the dream differently. And
mm,
that's what this is all about. That's to consciously step in to our own evolution. And that's what's being presented to us. That's what we're being invited to participate in. It's not just a passive insight, it's a realization that we then step into the dream in a way. And by us doing that and embodying that, then it becomes, it's like contagious, that realization. That's the idea of the Sangha in Buddhism.
mm.
It's profound when you hang
Yeah,
out with
yeah.
other
We're
people.
reaching a tipping point. I feel that we're awakening, but as we're awakening, there's an equal and opposite force trying to push it down, and we're seeing that with everything going on in the
Totally,
world. And I would say
totally.
that it's a little bit like, if you have a pus that comes up to the surface, it needs to come up to the surface to then be purged. So what we're seeing, I
Right.
think, is the darkness on the planet right now coming up to the surface. The first few lot of people, the awakened ones, can see what's going on. It's up to us to then be like the antibodies. It's up to be us to be able to
Yeah, I mean,
cleanse
it's
that.
up for us to be the antipsychotic agents,
Exactly. Yeah,
is one way of saying it.
absolutely.
And in trauma, they talk about when a trauma, because think about what the pathology of trauma is. It's the repetition compulsion, like I was
Yeah.
saying. And as the repetition compulsion gets more and more intense and more seems to be taking over and it gets more and more amplified, that's an expression that it's getting closer to consciousness. It's getting closer to being integrated. It's the same idea.
Yeah, fantastic. As you know, if people are watching this, you can see this is just an absolutely fascinating subject. And Paul is an absolute scholar on this type of stuff. I know he says he's not, and he's just a regular guy, but he's done an enormous amount of work. He's written some great books on this. Would you like to direct the audience to your websites and everything else?
Sure. Okay. So the way I would say it, if people are interested in to awaken in the dream, go to awakeninthedream.com. That's my website. And a ton of articles, all for free, ton of interviews just like this, all for free. It's not monetized. There's no paywall because I just want to get this. Of course, people can buy a book or
Mm.
I do sessions, but I just, this is medicine, and it's medicine not only for me, like as I've more been able to articulate this, it's helped me to integrate, and I realize, oh my God, this is like medicine for so many people. That's kind of why I'm just offering it. And yeah,
Mm.
so that would be how people could find out about my work.
Yeah, fantastic. Paul, thank you so much.
Totally. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.